Hi everybody, thanks for joining me today. Today we're going to have a little bit of fun. This is called Stories from the Console. So what's going to happen today is I'm going to share some humorous stories about becoming an organist and my life as a church musician, and we're going to listen to some lovely music. And that's what we're going to start with right now. Okay, so it was back in the fall of 1979. I had just turned 16 years old, and I got my first real fill out a W-2, get a paycheck job. I was hired by the Fresno Falcons hockey team to be their official organist. I was thrilled. I mean, as a teenage boy, my first job was supposed to be flipping burgers, but instead, I was at an arena entertaining hundreds of rabid hockey fans. My parents, well, they were not so thrilled. Playing doodlies at a sports arena was not what they had in mind for me. My parents wanted me to be a concert pianist, and when I was just 5 years old, I was sent to music school to begin my carefully planned training to fulfill their ego-gratifying dreams. My father's dream was to be seated in the front row of a great concert hall with me at a 9-foot Steinway concert grand piano in front of a symphony orchestra playing Rachmaninoff. Hey, you, that's my son. My mother's dream was to have a little miniature human being that she could cart around to parties and show off. You see that? I made that. That's all me. Dance, monkey, dance! So let's take a look at this. Here's a shot from that time in my life. Yeah, I don't think an 8-year-old should really have an official headshot. So at any rate, my descent into the madness that would be so gravely disappointing to my parents began when I was just 13 years old at this place. This is Pizza and Pipes in Fresno, California. It, of course, is long gone now, and there really aren't that many great pictures of it. This was really the only one I could find, but it does show you kind of what was there. So I took one look at that setup, and I knew right away that I wanted to be an organist. Now, why would my parents, who were busy grooming me to be a pianist, be so terribly upset with the thought of me being an organist? Well, in a word, snobbery. My parents were gigantic narcissistic snobs. My dad objected fiercely to what he saw as that god-awful noise they're trying to pass off as music. And my mother, it was a pizza parlor, and so there's not a lot of Rachmaninoff going on at a pizza parlor. For my mother, it was, oh, the tackiness of the whole affair. She sure couldn't bring her snooty friends to a pizza parlor to show off her little miniature human being. But me, I was undeterred, and I went out and found a way. Back to the music. So, in order to follow up with my dream of being an organist, I started hanging around in organ stores, where I met people who gave me lessons and a place to practice. I also ended up meeting the lead organist over at Pizza and Pipes, and he invited me to come by after hours to try out the big Wurlitzer. In a move that would prove to be both shrewd and fortuitous, I asked my grandparents to take me to Pizza and Pipes. We arrived close to the end of the last set, and I stepped up to the organ and I played a few songs I was working on. And on the drive home, my grandparents got all misty-eyed about their first date at a silent movie accompanied by an organ just like the one that I had just played. It turned out that this was just 2 weeks before my grandmother passed away. So I'd like to play something here that I haven't played since that night. This was my grandmother's very, very favorite song. It's Traumerei by Robert Schumann. So after my grandmother's funeral, my grandfather took a really intense interest in my organ playing. He started hanging out at the organ store with me, and he convinced the owners to put together a recital featuring me. So the night of the concert, my grandfather, of course, was terribly, terribly proud, and my parents were there. And the strangest thing happened. When the music was over, my parents went around bragging about being my parents. And I was completely shocked. I thought, wow, they finally came around. And then we got in the car, and I must have had the biggest grin on my face. And my mother turned to me and said,
I have never been so embarrassed in my life. What in the world were you doing talking to the audience? That has got to be the tackiest, most uncivilized thing I have ever heard. Oh, and by the way, you stink at it.
Now, I'm not going to try and recreate what my mother did next because, quite frankly, it's offensive. I'll just tell you what it was. She started mimicking me as if I had an uncontrollable stutter. So, the next thing my grandfather did was contact the owners of the Warner's Theater and arrange for me to give a performance there. Now, this was kind of a private event, just some friends and family. And my parents were there, and the same routine followed. They went around bragging about being proud parents, and then as soon as we got home, the unfounded criticism started in. So my mom and dad's respective critiques would really remain the same for the rest of their lives. My dad is perpetually disappointed that his own son is just too stupid to make better musical choices, and mom is forever embarrassed at my lack of sophistication. My parents continued to try and thwart my musical explorations, mostly through copious quantities of shame, guilt, and mocking, all of which was centered around their narcissistic need to control every aspect of my life. And at one point, they actually tried to forbid me to hang out at the organ store, which of course would have left me without a place to practice. That's clever, huh? All right, so at this point, I'd like to play something of my own. This is called Hitting Bottom. So, as things went along, the next thing my grandfather did for me was to buy a pipe organ and install it in his house. This is me at a family Christmas party, and really the only explanation I have for that costume is that, well, it was the 70s. So at this point, there really seemed to be nothing that was going to stop me from reaching my musical goals. Now, you might get the impression that my grandfather was kind of the savior of everything. Kind of, but my relationship with my grandfather wasn't really all sunshine and roses. Like my parents, my grandfather had huge control issues. And while he was extremely supportive of my organ playing, he was really only supportive if it was on his terms. And on many occasions, he tried to use the gift of the organ as a tool to dominate my life. You know, if my grandfather were alive today, I really believe that he probably would have been diagnosed with some type of mental disorder, because every few days he was off on some really weird obsession. And he would spend several days obsessing on some topic and ranting about it and telling us all about it. And of course, in most cases, these rants were meant to prove his superiority over others. So a typical thing would be that he'd barge through the front door right about dinner time. You know, you can't hypnotize me. I'm too stubborn for that. Oh, yes, no man with a swinging watch is going to make me cluck like a chicken. No, sir. You know, people today are just weak-minded. You kids, you will never know what real hardship is, and you'll never be as tough as me. Back in my day, you had to be strong. Why, we didn't have these psychobabbling hucksters going about hypnotizing people and taking their money and making them act stupid. What a bunch of fools this current generation is, being hypnotized. Well, you ain't gonna hypnotize me. Now, of course, I guess he saw some, movie or something where a guy with a watch made somebody go on a murder spree or something silly like that. But just, he took it so seriously. And it wasn't enough that he would come over and tell his family about this. No, he went door to door on this one, knocking on our neighbors' doors and telling them all about how he couldn't be hypnotized. And so, thanks to my grandfather, we were kind of known as the crazy family down the street. So when you break it all down, it's both because of my family and a little bit in spite of my family that I became a professional musician. The fact is, my parents got me started, and my grandfather did give me a lot of support. And for that, I am very, very grateful. Most of my family's nonsense was just annoying. Ultimately, my love of music would win the day. So I've been working as a professional organist for now 40 years. I was still a teenager when I added church organist to my hockey game and pizza parlor credentials. And so I'd like to share a couple of stories about my life as a church organist. As you might imagine, after 40 years of doing something, so a few adventures have cropped up along the way. So, church people are, for the most part, just like everybody else. Church is just another part of their life. They have a favorite team, they go to the movies, they do all the normal things that everybody else does. But most churches do have their fair share of overly pious posers who seek to use their status to influence church activities. So the first church that I was employed in full-time had really just a dreadful organ. It was an old, worn-out home organ, and I made a number of modifications to it to try and just get a little more out of it. But in the end, it was really constantly a source of disappointment. Really not an appropriate instrument for a church. But this church was very small, and having a full-time musician was really a big step for them. So there wasn't much hope of getting the church board to go for a new, more appropriate instrument, unless that one just flat broke down. So early one Sunday morning, I arrived at church before anybody else. I turned the old organ on, and then I went over to the office to make some coffee. And when I got back, the church was filled up with smoke, and the organ was on fire. Now, I'll admit, I was a little gleeful at the sight, but I did get the fire extinguisher and put it all out. So at this point, the church board did go ahead and approve the purchase of a new instrument. Well, this absolutely infuriated the Grand Master of all pious posers, a guy we will call Jay. Jay went out and he argued with me about it, and he argued with the pastor about it. He called the bishop, he wrote letters to the editor of the local newspaper, and his argument was simply that a little church like that should just accept whatever organ there was that they could get for free. Well, he just didn't understand the difference between an instrument that's appropriate for liturgical music and one that's really meant to be a toy in somebody's living room. No amount of reasoning was ever going to get through to Jay. He was going to fight this one to the death. Well, the church moved forward with its fundraising, and no amount of protest from Jay was going to stop the church from buying a new organ. So, in what I can only assume was an act of desperation, Jay got rip-roaring drunk one night and called me at home. Hello? Yeah, Tony, this is Jay. Hi, Jay, what can I do for you? I want you to stop manipulating the Holy Spirit in order to get your way with the church. Jay, are you suggesting that I have authority over God? Yeah, and you better knock it off or I'm going to take you out. Now, the church did eventually get the new organ after about a year of fundraising, and Jay promptly terminated his membership, as one could expect. So I'm sure you've guessed by now that if I've been an organist professionally, mostly at churches for the last 40 years, that I've probably played at hundreds of weddings. I can tell you that almost all of them go off without a hitch. But I have played at a few where stuff happens. I was playing a big wedding over at a neighboring church, and at that particular church, you really couldn't see down the aisle from where the organ console was. So the young lady that sang that day was spotting for me, and it came time to march the bride in. And so I'm playing, and I get to a place where I figure, they might be done by about now. And I looked over at my spotter, who indicated, keep going, keep going. So I kept going, and I kept going, and I got to another spot where I thought, maybe they're done by about now. And I looked over at my spotter, and she said, keep going, keep going. So I'm playing, and I'm quite frankly running out of stuff to play at this point. And I looked over at my spotter, and she finally said, okay, they're done. At this point, the spotter grabs me and pulls me out into the hall. Oh my God, the father of the bride was proudly marching his daughter down the aisle. They got about halfway when the mother of the bride jumped from her seat, ran down the aisle, got in a fist fight with the dad, shoved him in the nearest pew, and marched her daughter the rest of the way. Now, I was prepared for the worst, but the rest of the wedding went off without a hitch. And when it was all over, I found myself in the receiving line, and I congratulated the bride and groom. And the bride started apologizing to me for all the havoc. And I told her, no, don't even worry about that. And then, just to make conversation, I said to her, so I guess your parents don't get along very well. And she laughed and said, man, you don't know the half of it. And then she said, would you like to come to the reception? I have them seated together at the head table. I didn't end up going to that reception, but I hope it was just funny. Okay, we got one more piece, and then we're going to call it a day.